Today we're going to be covering Amending the Constitution, which is Chapter 3, Sections 2 and 3. The LEQ for today is How is the Constitution a living, breathing document? The United States Constitution became effective in 1789. That makes the United States Constitution the longest active plan of government in the world. That is an amazing feat considering how much the country has changed over the last 223 years. In 1789, the country stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Appalachian Mountains. Those are the mountains that we see every morning in our valley to the west. There were only 13 states stretching along that coast with a population of less than 4 million. Today we have 50 states that stretch from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific coast, including Alaska and Hawaii, and we have over 300 million citizens. The country has changed tremendously. How has the Constitution endured? The answer is through amendments. The Constitution's ability to be changed and to adapt with our country as we grow and change. So today we're going to take a look at the formal amendment process. Article 5 of the United States Constitution provides the process for amending or altering the Constitution. There are two main ways that an amendment can be proposed and two methods for ratification. The graphic that we'll see on the next slide will help walk us through how the Constitution can be amended. If we look at the graphic, along the left-hand side you have two boxes under the words Types of Proposals. There are two ways that an amendment can be proposed, and there are also two ways that an amendment can be ratified. Let's take a look at option 1. Option 1 will have a proposal by Congress, that is the United States House of Representatives and the United States Senate, by a 2/3 vote in both of those houses. The ratification that typically goes with this type of proposal is to be ratified by state legislatures, and we need 3/4 of the state legislatures to approve an amendment before it can be attached to the United States Constitution. We have 50 state legislatures, so 3/4 of 50 state legislatures is 38. Interesting note, 26 of our 27 amendments have been adopted in this manner. Option 2 is to have an amendment proposed by a national convention when requested by 2/3 of the state legislatures. For this method, what you would have is you would have a national convention held somewhere in the country, and each state would send a certain number of delegates to that convention. And at the convention, the delegates who are normal citizens, the only requirement is of voting age, they would get together and discuss the types of changes that they would like to see in the Constitution and come up with a formal proposal. A method for ratification that can go with this is to be ratified by conventions held within 3/4 of the individual states. That means typically what you see there is all 50 states will hold a convention, but you need to have at least 3/4 of the 50 states, which is the number 38 again, to approve that proposal for it to be attached to the United States Constitution. One of our 27 amendments have been proposed in this manner. Now there are two other methods for proposal and ratification that have never actually got an amendment passed, but they do exist, and that would be to be proposed by Congress with a 2/3 vote in both houses and ratified by conventions held in 3/4 of the states, and the opposite, to be proposed by a national convention when requested by 2/3 of the state legislatures, and then to be ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures. Now, if we go into or inside the numbers, as I like to do sometimes, I find it kind of interesting. I have some numbers that you might want to make note of here. Over the 223 years that our Constitution has been active, there have been 15,000 proposals for an amendment. Only 33 have left the proposal stage and went to the states to be ratified, either by state legislatures or by conventions in the states. And of course, only 27 amendments have actually passed the mustard and been ratified and attached to our Constitution. Now, the amendment process and adding an amendment to the Constitution is a great example of federalism and popular sovereignty working together. Now, yesterday, or the day before, since yesterday was a block, we learned that federalism is the sharing of power between a central government, that is our government in Washington, D.C., and several smaller governments. In our case, here in the United States, that would be the 50 individual state governments. Now, in popular sovereignty is that government gets all the power from the people. That means that we, the people, get to decide what goes on. So the amendment process is a combination of those two things, a sharing of power between central government and state governments, and an idea that the people have the final say here in our country. Now, we can see this reflected in the fact that the formal amendment process happens at the state level and at the national level. Most proposals are done nationwide, either in Congress or by a national convention. But then to be ratified and to be added to the Constitution, it has to go out to each of the individual states, and the individual states will make that final decision. So that's a sharing of power at the national level and at the federal level. And ultimately, amendments reflect the will of the people, and that's the idea of popular sovereignty, and that government gets all of its power from us, the people. And we can see that it actually works, as we mentioned with the numbers on the last slide. You know, there's been 15,000 proposals since 1789, and only 27 ratified amendments. So the process does work. Now, the Constitution is very well written, as we talked about in the previous lesson, in that it's not chock full of details. It's written on 6 broad, basic principles that we hold true, and all the details were left to be filled in by other means. And that's what this slide talks about. This slide is going to talk about how the Constitution can change daily life by other means. One of those means is basic legislation. That would be box number 1. That's what we're going to talk about first. The Constitution, as we mentioned, is very brief, so it needs to have detail added to it. And our basic legislation, that is our United States Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate, proposing bills and passing bills and having them sent off to the President to be signed into law, those are able to fill in the details, fill in the cracks, if you will, that the Constitution doesn't spell out. This makes the Constitution quite flexible. It makes it somewhat of a living, breathing document, as it can change over time. As we've seen, getting an amendment passed is a difficult feature. We've had 15,000 proposals over the last 223 years. We've only had 27 amendments. By contrast, legislation is quite easy to get passed. It takes only a 51% majority vote in the House and in the Senate to get a law passed. Likewise, it only takes a 51% vote in the House, majority vote in the House and in the Senate, to get a bill overturned. It is much easier to pass a law and to revoke a law than it is to amend the Constitution. And this is one of the genius things about the Constitution that has allowed it to last for 223 years and made it the longest living form of government. Number 2 box here is executive decisions. Now, executive decisions is the privilege of the President to make a decision about which way or what direction the country should go in. And this is another chance for a president to add detail to the Constitution, rather than that detail being written in this Article 2 of the Constitution, which spells out the President's duties. An example of an executive decision that fills in some of the details left out of the Constitution is the President's ability to send troops abroad to protect American interests without a formal declaration of war. As we looked at in our previous lesson, Article 1 of the Constitution, which lays out the responsibilities of the legislature, says that only Congress can declare war. The President of the United States cannot declare war. The Supreme Court cannot declare war. The citizens of the United States cannot declare war. That is something that only the United States Congress can do. However, Article 2 of the Constitution makes the President the Commander-in-Chief, so he is able, being the commander of the armed forces, to send them abroad to protect our interests. Another example of how executive decisions can add detail to the Constitution without actually changing the Constitution is by way of executive agreements. Executive agreements occur when the President, who's the head of our government, enters into an agreement with the head of another government. And this gives him a chance to, again, further American interests, and it's not something that has to be written into the Constitution and changed at a later date through a painstaking process. The third box to the right across the top is the United States Constitution decisions. That's what USSC stands for. That's the United States Supreme Court and their decisions. Now, the United States Supreme Court has the job of interpreting law. The legislature makes the law. The President signs any bills that the legislature makes and makes it a law, and his job is to then carry it out. And the United States Supreme Court interprets that law. They determine whether or not the laws are fair and reasonable, and they apply to the Constitution. Very often, U.S. Supreme Court decisions become the law of the land without actually having a law written and passed by Congress and enforced by the President per se. An example of this is the landmark Roe v. Wade decision. That's Roe, R-O-E, v. Wade, W-A-D-E, and that decision came in the mid-1970s, and it was a determination by the United States Supreme Court that women had a right to make decisions about their body. This became the case, as we'll look at in future lessons, that allowed abortions to be legal in the United States. This is a law that hasn't been changed since that Supreme Court ruled that women do have that right to free choice. Box number 4, which is the first one to the left on the bottom, is activities of political parties. Now, the United States Constitution says nothing about the nomination of candidates to either run for the President of the United States or to run for Congress or Senate. That has been left to the decision making of the political parties that we have in place. So here's an example of there's no laws written in the Constitution saying that a political party has to go through steps A, B, and C before they can nominate a candidate. And then 50 years later, if circumstances have changed and you no longer need to go through steps A, B, and C, there'd have to be an amendment to the Constitution. Without actually writing that detail in the Constitution and allowing it to fall into the plate of political parties, we've again allowed our Constitution to be very flexible, to change with times, and to be that living, breathing document. The last box that we're going to cover here is customs. Customs are unwritten laws. They are just practices that our society has done year in and year out, and very often customs become much stronger than laws because this is the way things have been done, and by and large people don't like to make changes. An example of this is the unwritten custom that was started by our first president, George Washington. There's no law saying, or was no law when he became the president of the United States, saying how many terms a president could hold that office. He held 2 4-year terms. That was 8 years in a row of being the president, and then stepped aside. And that became the unwritten custom and unwritten law up until Franklin Roosevelt won election in 1932, and then won re-election in 1936, and then won re-election in 1940, and then won re-election again in 1944. He actually was elected to the office of president 4 times, becoming the first president to hold office more than 2 times. After Franklin Roosevelt's passing, the United States actually passed a law that created a term limit for presidents, saying that a president could only hold the office of presidency twice for a matter of 4 years each, or 8 years total, and that custom then had to become a law. But that is another example of how we can have constitutional changes by other means than the amendment process. So, this was our lesson on amending the Constitution. Remember, the LEQ is, how is the United States Constitution a living, breathing document? I invite you to think about that question, as you may see it in your near future. Hint, hint, hint. That will likely be a question on the quiz on Friday. Thank you very much.